facilitators, they are process designers. It's not that you need to be a subject matter expert. You're there to manage the dynamics of the room, when people do get together.
Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the host of Google Firestarters. And Firestarters, if you don't know, is an insightful conversation series that we do with the interested and interesting of the advertising, marketing, innovation communities. And today I'm speaking with Alison Coward, who is the founder of Bracket, and also the author of a brand new book on workshop culture called Workshop Culture, a guide to building teams that thrive. So Alison, welcome to Firestarters. Delighted to have you. What is your provocation for the Firestarters audience?
So my provocation is workshops have the potential to change the workplace.
Brilliant. Good. Okay, so let's dive into this because I'm a facilitator myself. I run quite a lot of workshops, so really interested in how workshop culture can actually how companies can get more value out of workshops. So tell me a bit more about why you think the kind of value here is a bit underrated, why organizations might be perhaps undervaluing the kind of role that workshops can have in their culture.
Yeah, so I guess firstly, I'll start off by defining workshop culture. So I coined this phrase, workshop culture. As a facilitator myself, I saw what was happening in workshops and seeing that it was a real shame that when we got to the end of a workshop, when I facilitated a workshop, that more often than not, people would just go back to their day the next day and almost kind of forget the feeling that a workshop brought. So I coined this phrase. I define it as a team culture that uses the principles and practices of facilitation and workshops to achieve high performance. And that's essentially what it is. It's like, what can we learn from what happens in workshops, which any facilitator will know that it's about collaboration, creativity, open conversation, psychological safety, and take that, and many more things, and take that into the rest of the organization. So all of that amazing stuff that happens in that time box period doesn't end when the workshop ends.
Yeah, and it was really interesting actually in the book. You kind of describe how workshops often have a lot of the characteristics that we want to see in kind of future fit organizations. So I think you list things like curiosity and learning and experimentation and communication and progress and things like this. So so I guess my question here is that workshops can be a useful tool, but what you're really talking about is the role that they can play in the wider culture of the organization and teams. Is that right?
100%. And like you say, when you are in a really great workshop, either as a facilitator or participant, you see teams working in a way that you just think, do you know what, why don't we work like this all the time? What is it that's happening here that we don't usually see? And therefore, what can we learn from both what the facilitator is doing and the participants are doing, and instill it into the way that we work on an ongoing basis? And like you mentioned, it's those things like curiosity, it's experimentation, it's being comfortable with ambiguity and kind of the messiness that comes up with creativity when we're playing around and experimenting in a workshop. The deep empathy and the listening that comes between participants. We need all of that for high performing teams. We need all of that for business performance.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I guess it would be really good to dive into a bit more as a facilitator, how you might create the right kind of tone in a workshop to enable all of those good things that you talk about there.
Yeah, so it starts way before the workshop starts. As a facilitator, you're kind of taking a real step back and you're thinking, okay, if I have got this amount of time with these people, what is it that we want to leave the workshop having done, perhaps having experienced, having explored, and even thinking beyond the end of the workshop, thinking, okay, if we do achieve all of that, what impact is it going to have on the business? How are we going to integrate all of those learnings? What change do we want to see after the workshop? And then you're kind of working backwards and thinking, okay, so what are the conditions that I need to create in that? What are some of the discussions that we need to have? What are some of the questions that we need to ask together? And therefore, what are some of the activities that we need to run to help us get to that outcome? So there's that from the sort of a practical point of view. And, facilitators, they are process designers. It's not that you need to be a subject matter expert. You're there to manage the dynamics of the room. When people do get together, any group gets together, there's going to be some kind of dynamic that happens or emerges from the fact that people are together with different personalities and different viewpoints. And a facilitator's role is to manage those dynamics and ensure that it is productive rather than destructive. So you will design a process to make sure that that happens, design activities. And then, when you get in the room, a lot of this can also be designed up front, but when you get in the room, it is like, how do you create that environment where people feel safe to speak up? How do you create the environment that signals that we are here to be creative and explore together, and there are these clear outcomes that we're all working towards, and we're all aligned towards, and we're all kind of pushing towards, and how do we get there in the best way?
So let's dive into that a bit more, because you mentioned about psychological safety. I mean, I love the sort of thought of facilitators as kind of process designers, but also, as you say, it's really important to create the right kind of atmosphere and environment in which people can perhaps disagree with each other in a healthy way, or contribute ideas. So what's the way in which you can create that kind of culture, not just in the workshop, but perhaps in the team environment?
Yeah, and so the work that I do extends, obviously, because it extends beyond the workshop. So you have to be kind of very careful. If there is a low level of psychological safety in a team beforehand, like if they're experiencing lots of conflict, there's low productivity, people aren't trusting each other, and then you have to be quite careful about how you introduce that into a workshop. It's almost kind of like experimenting and introducing it in small doses so that people experience what it's like to be in a psychologically safe environment. So it might be an exercise that opens people up, for example, a creative exercise that is not related to the work that they're doing, which is just about brainstorming. It could be, the kind of the classic improvisation, yes, and I did this with a team recently. I got someone to kind of share an event that was coming up, and they mentioned their daughter's birthday, and we just did a yes and activity where they were, the team were generating ideas for what this person's daughter could do for their birthday, and there were no wrong answers, no bad answers at this point. It was just about building on each other's idea. So there's that, and it's, again, the signaling. I always talk about the difference, or being clear about the difference between divergent and convergent thinking, and what happens when those two types of thinking are muddled up. So divergent thinking is all about generating ideas and being open and looking at possibilities. That's what we see as classic brainstorming. Whereas convergent thinking is where we need to move towards a decision and sort of close in on an idea that we might move forward with. And both of those types of thinking are needed in the creative process, because without convergent thinking, everything just stays open. Too much convergent thinking, then we don't get to explore ideas, and we don't kind of get to step in that creativity. And even just kind of saying, okay, now we're in a divergent thinking phase versus a convergent, and then when we switch to convergent, again signaling that and putting sort of guardrails around how people critique ideas is a way of also creating some psychological safety in that workshop.
So that's really useful, actually, that. Thank you. I think one of the models which I use a lot, actually, which I think is just brilliant at talking about team culture, and is Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. And as you were speaking there, I was just thinking about that, because that's like a pyramid model. It's like the foundation is trust, or absence of trust is a dysfunction in the team environment. Then you have that kind of fear of conflict, where people feel that they can't contribute ideas and healthily disagree with each other. And the point about that is that if you don't feel like you have contributed ideas to the team environment, you're less committed, which is the 3rd dysfunction, to
Yes.
actually making those team outcomes happen, and therefore you can't hold each other to account as a team. And then finally, the inattention to results, because you're paying attention to your own results rather than the team results. So I love it as a model, but that sort of commitment, it feels like what you're saying there is that if you create the right environment, that everybody should be able to contribute, and therefore should be more committed to the outcomes of the workshop. Is that right?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, the role of a facilitator is there is the dynamic, and one of the dynamics that, often comes into play when we're facilitating workshops, or one of the reasons why we're asked to facilitate workshops, is because there will naturally be people within a group that are more dominant than others for various reasons, others that, take a bit more of a back seat. And within a high performing team, everyone's skills, expertise, characteristics, backgrounds are valued equally, regardless of seniority, regardless of who feels comfortable speaking up in a group. And when you can create that equality in a workshop, that sort of leveling out, then a team are creating together. I have a sort of a framework that I talk about in the book, and the first step is alignment. It's a 5-pillar framework, and the first step is alignment, and kind of creating that compelling vision as a team, that purpose, and what it is that we're all working towards, is sort of one of the first steps in almost kind of counteracting some of the challenges that might come up throughout a collaborative process, because that vision is so compelling that everyone kind of knows, well, okay, what we're experiencing here is just a little blip on the road there, but actually what we're trying to get to is much bigger than this challenge or this barrier that we're experiencing.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about exercises and the role of kind of exercises in kind of enabling that kind of openness and creating the right kind of environment. I'm personally quite a big fan of games, and sort of playing games in workshops as a way of learning and as a way of sort of bringing people together and just creating a bit of fun as well. So what do you think is the role of fun in a workshop? Do you think that has a part to play?
100%. And I think this is it. I mean, it's when I think of fun in workshops, I don't necessarily think of things that are what people might describe as playful, but the process of engaging in a workshop and that kind of collaborative atmosphere, that sort of deep thinking that you get when people are committed to a purpose, that brings engagement and enjoyment. Sort of, we're thinking about frameworks, Daniel Pink's book Drive, where he talks about autonomy, mastery and purpose, and having those three aspects in place for people to feel a deep sense of engagement, enjoyment in their work. That's what I'm kind of working towards when I think about workshops, and it can be through games, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And I guess the reason and I'm a massive fan of the book Game Storming. It's one of my sort of biggest influences in all of this work. And when you sort of look at the sort of a lot of the activities in that book, Game Storming, they're not kind of classic games. It's sort of the way that they describe, people are standing up, where, if you're in an in-person workshop, they're using the walls, they're kind of, making things with their hands, it's tangible, they're using artifacts. And that's, I guess, the playful aspect that I think of. I think something else came up when you mentioned there is sort of around workshops. I think one of the big ways that we can really explore the way that we work together and take influence from workshops is in our meetings, in our regular meetings that we have. We can take some of those principles of, things like games and game storming to run our regular meetings, which is often something that doesn't come to mind when we think about how we work together. Our meetings have such a massive impact on our culture and how we interact with each other. I think that's such a missed opportunity for so many teams and organisations to change the way that people work together through addressing the way that they run their meetings.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess I'd like to ask a bit more about how you kind of set the room up, I suppose, as well, and the kind of environment you're creating, and also just the role of kind of reflection, I suppose, as well, because it strikes me what you're saying there is in order to create the right kind of atmosphere, you need people to open up, and so there's something here about maybe setting that kind of environment early by enabling a kind of reflection where you're enabling people to open up and be vulnerable, perhaps, as a way to just kind of set the right tone for you can say anything. It's a safe space. So do you think there's kind of a role for actually reflection in here as well as perhaps fun and exercise and learning?
100%. And sort of with most of the things that I'm saying, reflection in workshops and reflection in the work that we do generally in organisations. So one great way, very easy way of starting off a meeting or a workshop is to do a check-in, which is where you ask everyone a question that could be related to work, could be personal, could be anything, but just a question that gets everyone to contribute in whatever way is suitable or relevant for that workshop. So it could be, if you're running an online workshop, a simple, dropping something into the chat. It could be, verbally, it could be using post-it notes, but that I think Atul Gawande calls it the activation phenomenon. So that activation at the start of a session signals to everyone, this is not going to be a gathering where you are expected to just sit back and consume. We want you to get involved right from the start.
Yeah.
And there are sort of classic, I think, there's we have to be careful about sort of icebreakers, because some people really have an aversion towards icebreakers, as in the sense. So I kind of like to, especially if people haven't experienced working in this way before, launching into something that makes people feel uncomfortable. I know some facilitators will really challenge me on this. I think launching into something that makes people feel uncomfortable initially, I actually try not to do that. I go from the other angle. I try and make people feel comfortable and gradually increase the discomfort rather than going kind of straight in.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought about gradually increasing the discomfort, I suppose, to enable people to kind of really contribute sort of more challenging sort of thoughts and thinking, and really say what they mean, I guess. And what about how you might sort of set the room up in terms of physically the environment and the kind of furniture you might have in the room, or the things you have on the walls? Any sort of tips really there for how you would set that up?
Yeah, I've got sort of a little bit of a funny story. I remember sort of quite early on in my facilitation career, it wasn't even career, it was experience. I was kind of testing out facilitation because I didn't really know what it was. And I offered to facilitate a meeting for a group that I was part of. And I just remember going in, setting up the room in sort of, pods, post-it notes on the table, flip chart, and someone walked in and just instantly just said, "Oh, you're not going to make us work, are you?" So just that setup of the room signaled that this was going to be different to what, it wasn't a long conference table where there would be sort of monologues. We were going to get our hands dirty, so to speak. So I think that's a really good way of just, if you are able to use a physical space, it's just a really good way of signaling this is going to be different to how we usually work.
Yeah, brilliant. And let me ask a bit about the roles of workshops as well, because they can, of course, provide many different kind of outcomes, from learning to kind of creative thinking and ideas, or just to formulate a strategy. So tell me a bit more about the various roles you think that workshops can play in supporting an organisation or team goal.
Yeah, going back to sort of the process factor that I mentioned, I think there's kind of two areas really. There's content and there's process. So there's workshop to create content together, which might be a strategy, might be a new idea, and also just largely to frame this conversation. When I'm talking about workshops, I'm talking about those collaborative workshops as opposed to training workshops, so kind of co-creation workshops. So there's content workshops where you are creating something together, and then there's kind of more process related workshops where you might be actually talking about how you work together, so sort of more team culture related workshops. I kind of call them the workshop culture workshops, in a sense, that are a bit meta, because you're kind of using a co-creation process to co-create how you're going to work together.
Yeah, I love that thought of that workshop culture workshop.
Yeah.
It's a great way of actually thinking about the role they can play in actually setting a kind of new way of working and a new kind of 100%. Atmosphere or environment within the team. So when you're sort of working through something like that, how would you formalize or kind of agree kind of ways of working? What's the kind of output of or outcome of something like that?
Yeah, so I can talk about the framework that I talk about in the book, which is the first step is around alignment. Just really a team needs to be pointing in the same direction, knowing what they're all working towards together, and ensuring that they are on the same page, because often, it may be implied that we all know what we're doing and we're all here to do, but sometimes that isn't really clear. And then there's the cohesion pillar, which is, okay, now we've understood the direction we're working towards. How do we all individually contribute? So if sort of alignment is almost like zooming out and looking at the big picture, cohesion is zooming in and thinking about all of the pieces of the puzzle. Who's in the team? What skills do we have? What expertise do we each bring? And most importantly, how do we all work differently? And because that's kind of one of the biggest sources of conflict within a team, not being able to see things from somebody else's perspective and not understanding why somebody works in the way that they do. But one of the value within a team is the fact that people work differently and have those different perspectives, right? So bringing that all out and exploring that and kind of showing all of the sort of the diversity within the team, and then creating that kind of empathy and understanding for each other, because again, that's going to help when a team experiences roadblocks or barriers. The third piece is around communication. So what is it that we need to talk about if we're sort of thinking about that's where we want to achieve, that's our vision? What is it that we need to talk about, and in what format do those conversations take, i.e. how do we meet, and how can we make our meetings as productive as possible for what we need to get done? Again, sort of, in terms of taking inspiration from workshops, often when I work with a team, I see that they will have meetings, but all of those meetings are literally, let's put a time in the calendar, let's turn up, we've got an agenda, when actually there's different types of conversations that need to happen. Some conversations are more about ideas generation, some conversations are more about making decisions, some conversations are more about sharing updates, and they all have a different energy. And I find if a team can kind of look at what those different types of conversations are and what format they're going to take, then that will help them be more productive, be more creative, create a workshop culture. And then there's this design element. So design is essentially designing routines and rituals that will help us to stay accountable, stay engaged, stay motivated, stay on track. Rituals, it could be how do we celebrate a project when we've finished it? How do we kick off a project? What are some of the things that we do throughout a project to stay up to date, and also most importantly to stay connected, particularly in this era of kind of remote and hybrid? What are some of the things that we're doing throughout the way that we're working together to make sure that we are still working towards building our team as we're working together? So all of those things that don't happen naturally when we're working remotely, how do we stay connected? And then the final piece is around change. So knowing that our teams, as much as the environment around us is changing, our teams are changing, and we need to kind of review the ways that we're working on an ongoing basis. It's not that we kind of set a way of working and then that's it forever. We have to be as dynamic as the environment around us.
Yeah, I love the thought about the meetings piece that you were talking about there, about how each meeting can play a different role and so should be really facilitated perhaps in a different way. So let's get on to meetings, because lots of people complain about meetings. There's too many of them. Perhaps they're run in a bad way. Any tips really that you can draw out of kind of workshop culture to help you run meetings, day-to-day meetings, better?
Yeah, the first tip is to just take a step back and think, well, what's the purpose of this meeting? And often, I'm thinking about a team that I'm working with at the moment. There's so many different purposes wrapped up in one meeting that it just feels, when you take a step back, it feels really, really jumbled. So that would be the first step. Take a step back, be very clear on the purpose. Are you trying to mix up too many things in one meeting? Do they need to be separated out in the meeting, or even separated out into different meetings? And then be very clear on what you need to achieve from that meeting in terms of what do you need to produce or as an output. And then this is the shift for me, and this is a tool that I learned myself when I've been designing and facilitating workshops, is to, rather than list the things that you need to talk about, brainstorm a list of questions. Because if you start with questions rather than talking points, you're designing your meeting from a place of curiosity rather than this is the information that I need to transmit. So if you're thinking, okay, we need to get together and talk about this client, What are the things that we need to ask each other? Is the project going well? What do we know about this client? What have we learned? What hasn't worked well? How do we know, what do we know about what motivates this client? Those are all questions that, again, kind of create the foundation for an open discussion rather than, transmitting of information.
Yeah, some really good tips there. I really like that. And if I can, unfortunately, we're running short of time, but I just must ask also about remote, because you mentioned about sort of online, and obviously we've got hybrid working now. A lot of people working remotely. So how can you run meetings or workshops remotely in a way that is potentially as engaging as a in real life workshop? What are the tips there?
Gosh, I mean, I think one of the things that I think about, when I'm designing any kind of workshop is I think, what's the environment that I'm running that workshop in? So, if I'm running an in-person workshop, then I'll often ask the client if they can send me pictures of the room so that I can get a sense of, what are we working with here? And then, when I'm running a remote workshop, then I think about, the setup, the digital setup as my room. And I think, well, what have I got available to me? What tools have we got? Are we going to use sort of, the breakout rooms? Are we going to use online whiteboards? How are we going to use the chat? How are we going to use, even just the way that people are arranged in terms of visually on the space? And how do we use all of those tools for our, to get what we want to get out of the workshop?
Yeah, it's been super insightful, Alison. So thank you so much for being part of Firestarters, and some really useful tips there. I think as a facilitator myself, I think workshops are definitely undervalued. So I do agree with everything you've said today. But if you are watching this, of course, do subscribe and don't forget to share. But my thanks go to Alison for super insightful tips there on workshop culture. And don't forget her book, Workshop Culture, A Guide to Building Teams That Thrive, is out in November, I think, Alison, isn't it?
Yeah, 21st.
Brilliant, fantastic. So thanks to Alison, and thanks also for watching and listening to Firestarters.